His coat collar was pulled high. "I do not believe Anna acted entirely alone," Poirot said. "She did not administer the poison herself, that much I believe. She never said as much in her confession. She only took responsibility." "You think she had an accomplice?" Poirot gave a nod. "Someone who could move freely. Someone who understood timing and stage movement and had access to costumes and materials. Someone, perhaps, who didn't even know what they were part of until it was too late." "Who?" Hastings asked. Poirot's answer was almost a whisper. "A tenor." Hastings blinked. "One of the performers?" "There was a young man," Poirot said. "New to the company. Julien Marchand. Small roles. A talented voice, but no notoriety. And a strong affection for Anna Weiss." He walked to the edge of the foyer, pulled open a drawer in a side cabinet, and removed a file Masson had handed him earlier that day. "Julien Marchand," Poirot read aloud. 28. From Lyon. Joined the company 6 months ago. No family. No prior record. He looked at Hastings. He was the one who provided her the entrance key to the director's office. The one who arranged for the costume storage area to be unlocked. And he was the one, I suppose, who brought Madame Delacroix her final glass of champagne, thinking he was only obeying instructions. Unwitting? Hastings asked. "At first," Poirot said. "But I believe he knew what had happened the moment the scream rang out. And yet he said nothing. Helped Anna clean her tracks. Hid the missing glass. Disposed of the shawl." Poirot sighed. "Love, Hastings, is the most potent disguise of all." He turned the photo over, revealing a scribbled note from Masson. The man in the background had been tentatively identified. Matching height and build to Marchand. Not confirmed, but probable. "What will you do?" Hastings asked. "Nothing," Poirot said. Hastings looked stunned. "Nothing?" "She has confessed," Poirot said. "She has taken the burden upon herself. And he, if he was a pawn, has chosen to disappear. He departed the city 2 nights ago. Boarded a train to Lisbon. The Charité chose not to pursue." Hastings was quiet for a long moment. Then, with an uncharacteristic softness, he said, "Perhaps it's enough. The crime is solved. The guilty are known. And the opera can go on." Poirot looked up toward the high ceiling once more. "Yes," he said. "But I wonder, Hastings, if in our pursuit of justice, we sometimes forget mercy. Anna Weiss killed a woman. But the world made her a weapon long before she struck." They stood together in silence as the late afternoon light shifted to dusk. A single stagehand passed through the foyer, nodding politely before disappearing into the bowels of the theater. Poirot turned one final time to the mirror. "There," he said quietly. Hastings looked. "Where?" Poirot pointed to the reflection of the chandeliers above. "In the opera, there is always someone observing. Even after the last note fades. Even after the curtain falls." He adjusted his lapels, straightened his mustache, and took one final look at the theater that had hosted so much deception, so much passion, and now, at last, so much truth. Then, with Hastings at his side, he turned and walked away. Behind them, the great doors of the Palais Garnier closed with a soft but decisive click. And the silence that followed was not of tragedy, but of peace. The morning after their final visit to the Palais Garnier, Hercule Poirot sat once more at his breakfast table, his perfectly symmetrical eggs glistening on the plate beside a single, unbuttered croissant. The silver coffee pot gleamed under the filtered sunlight, and the aroma of dark roast filled the apartment on Rue des Capucines with a warmth that even the finest café in Paris could not replicate. Across the table, Captain Hastings nursed a second cup of coffee, less concerned with its aroma and more occupied with the pages of Le Figaro, folded to an article titled, "Murder at the Opera, Scandal, Secrets, and Justice Behind the Curtains." That he cleared his throat. "They're calling it the most sensational murder since the Rue Claire affair." He peeked over the top of the page at Poirot. "They quote you extensively, by the way." The crime was a composition of lies arranged like musical notes on a page. Very poetic. Poirot, seated upright, took a careful bite of toast. "It is always amusing, Hastings, when the journalists quote me with such flourishes. I do not recall using the word composition. That, I suspect, was their own addition." Hastings smiled. "Still, the public seems satisfied." Anna Weiss confessed. "Bellini and the others have been exposed. Even the director resigned in disgrace. Paris believes the curtain has truly fallen." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ah, but the theatre of life, mon ami, rarely concludes with such neat bows. The crowd may applaud, the critics may write their reviews, but for those involved in the performance, the quiet after the final note can be the most deafening." Hastings raised a brow. "You think the affair isn't over?" Poirot dabbed the corners of his mouth with a napkin and pushed his plate away. "I think it is concluded, but not complete." He stood, walked slowly to the window, and pulled back the curtain. The city lay below, brilliant in the morning sun. Horse-drawn carriages rattled past, mingling with the shouts of market vendors and the clatter of shopkeepers opening their shutters. It was Paris in her everyday costume, a far cry from the grand opera masks she wore by night. "You know what continues to trouble me, Hastings?" Poirot said, folding his hands behind his back. "What's that?" Poirot turned. "The poison." Hastings blinked. "The cyanide?" "Oui. A fast-acting agent. It leaves no time for fighting." And yet Madame Delacroix screamed, a cry sharp enough to halt a performance, loud enough to silence a theatre. "True," Hastings said. "You always said that cry was out of place." "Out of place and out of time," Poirot said. "You see, Hastings, by the time cyanide reaches the bloodstream, the muscles tighten, the breath seizes." But she screamed moments before the collapse. It was not pain. It was terror. "You mean she saw something?" "Exactly." Poirot's eyes were bright now. "Someone. And what do we do when we see something that should not exist? We cry out, not from agony, but from disbelief." Poirot crossed the room and picked up a small, black notebook resting on the mantel. It was the same one he had used throughout the case, filled with neat columns of names, times, and scribbled observations in fine blue ink that he opened to the final page and read aloud. "March 19, 9:47 p.m. Scream heard. Curtain falls. Madame Delacroix was found slumped forward in her chair. No signs of a struggle. No trace of spilled liquid. No broken glass." Poirot looked up. "No glass. No flask. No vial. So we asked ourselves, where did the poison come from? We assumed it had been slipped into her drink," Hastings said, "which assumes she drank from something." Hastings frowned. "But if she didn't? Then we have asked the wrong question entirely." Poirot walked to his desk and opened a slender drawer. From it, he removed a solitary object, sealed in a translucent envelope, a silk handkerchief, embroidered, monogrammed, and subtly soiled at the edges. V.B., Hastings muttered. "Bellini's handkerchief?" Poirot shook his head. "No, Hastings. That is what we were meant to believe. But this handkerchief was not dropped. It was planted. And if you look closely," he held it up. "It carries not just the monogram but the scent of bitter almonds. Faint, but present. It was laced." Hastings stood slowly. "You mean, she was poisoned through the cloth?" "Precisely. Delivered by hand. Perhaps a feigned kiss on the cheek, a polite gesture to hand her something. A silk handkerchief soaked in weak cyanide. Enough to kill within seconds when pressed to the skin or inhaled at close range." The anger, the perplexity, the cry, it all fits. Hastings exhaled. But that's even more personal. Someone had to be right beside her. Which narrows the list, Poirot said. Anna Weiss orchestrated the affair. She created the illusion of chaos, framed Bellini, and manipulated the board into exposing itself. But she did not deliver the poison. He turned back to the desk, flipped through the notes, and retrieved a final photograph, one taken during a gala 2 months prior. In it, Madame Delacroix stood among patrons and performers. Beside her, smiling, stood a woman in a modest black dress, poised, attentive, unremarkable. Do you remember her? Poirot asked. Hastings leaned closer. Isn't that the costume mistress? Louise Garnier? Oui. Keep quiet. Effective. A fixture backstage. Trusted by everyone. And completely invisible. But she was also close to Anna. More than a colleague. A guardian of sorts. A friend of the Weiss family, once a seamstress in Vienna, before the scandal. And she helped Anna? She delivered the poison, Poirot said. Anna planned it, but Louise administered it. That is why the scream came before the collapse. Delacroix recognized her. Saw a ghost from her past. Poirot picked up the telephone and dialed Inspector Masson. He spoke quietly for several moments, then returned to the table, his expression grave. She left Paris last night, Poirot said. Took a train under an assumed name. But we have her destination. Will you go after her? Poirot shook his head. No. That is for the law. My role ends here. He looked again at the photograph of Delacroix. In the end, Hastings, what Anna created was not merely a murder. It was a performance. One final act of defiance dressed in elegance and tragedy. And for that, we give her a moment of silence. They stood together at the window, watching the city breathe. Poirot, quiet and still, at last allowed a sigh. And now, he said softly, it is time for us to take our bow. Hastings smiled. You mean, we're leaving Paris? Oui, mon ami. There are other mysteries, other stages. But for now, perhaps we take the train to the countryside. A small inn. No opera, no intrigue. Only tea and silence. Poirot straightened his tie, adjusted his cuffs, and picked up his walking stick. As he and Hastings stepped out into the bright spring air, a passing breeze rustled the branches overhead, light, like the final whisper of a fading song. The city moved on, the theater prepared its next act, but Poirot, having uncovered every mask, every deception, and every truth beneath the grandest stage of all, allowed himself, for once, the simple satisfaction of justice complete, not loud. Not grand, but perfectly in tune. That it was 2 weeks later, and the Palais Garnier, reborn from scandal, once again echoed with the swelling strains of Verdi and Bizet. Paris, as she always did, had moved on. The opera-goers returned with cautious optimism, whispering of the murder less now with horror and more with the thrilled indulgence of those safely removed from danger. There were new posters, new castings, and, most notably, a new director, one who had not served on the disgraced board, but for Hercule Poirot, the case lingered like a final chord that had yet to resolve. He sat in a private compartment aboard the 10:04 train to Avignon, the countryside blurring past in soft strokes of green and gold. A straw boater rested in his lap, and a light summer coat hung neatly on the hook beside him. Across the table, Captain Hastings reclined with a little glass of vin blanc, his cap thrown back and a relaxed smile tugging at his features. I must admit, Hastings murmured, swirling the glass, it's good to be away. No murders, no poisoned Arius, no opera ghosts lurking behind the curtains. Just the quiet clatter of the rails and the countryside ahead. Poirot gave a small smile but said nothing. Hastings noticed the silence and tilted his head. Still thinking about Anna? Poirot raised an eyebrow. And why not, mon ami? When one comes so close to understanding the depths of pain, vengeance, and illusion, one does not simply turn the page. It is not like the end of a performance. He tapped a finger gently against his chin. The theater ends when the curtain falls. But in life, the consequences remain. What Anna Weiss did was wrong, immoral, unlawful, but it was also deeply human. Hastings looked thoughtful for a moment. Do you pity her? Pity? Poirot repeated. Non. But I understand her. That is a more dangerous thing, I think. There was a pause as the train veered slightly, the compartment swaying. Do you think, Hastings asked slowly, that justice was served? Poirot didn't answer immediately. He glanced out the window, his expression unreadable. Justice, he added finally, is often confused with punishment. But they are not the same. The law punishes. The law has dealt with Anna Weiss, with Bellini, with Vasseur, and with Moreau. But justice, that comes not from the courts, but from the restoration of balance. And has it been restored? Poirot turned to him. That is what I am trying to decide. He reached into his travel bag and pulled a tiny stack of envelopes, letters, all of them written in various handwriting, all posted in the last week. He laid them on the table one by one. This, he said, is the epilogue. Hastings leaned forward. The first is from Anna, Poirot said, tapping the top envelope. From her cell. She writes not to ask forgiveness, nor to justify her crime, but to explain why she did not run. She knew the law would catch her. She wanted it to. Because she had finally said everything no one had ever listened to. And with that, she said, she was at peace. Hastings swallowed. It's strange, isn't it? That one may find calm in the middle of such ruin. Poirot nodded. And yet, perhaps that is the only place it can be found. He picked up the second letter. This is from Franz Weber. Now living quietly in Lisbon. He has taken job as an art restorer. Ironic, is it not? After years of forgery, he now repairs what others have damaged. He smiled faintly. He included a painting. A little one. Of a theater stage, darkness, with a single spotlight shining on an empty chair. He titled it, The Final Note. He knew, Hastings said softly. Poirot nodded. He was aware. And like Anna, he has chosen not to flee the memories but to adapt it. He tapped the third letter. This is from Madame Lefebvre, the new director of the Palais Garnier. She writes to thank me for returning dignity to the Opera House. But she also asks something curious, whether I think the institution can truly separate itself from its past. Hastings blinked. What did you tell her? That it must not, Poirot replied. Because a place is only sacred when it remembers. Forgetting is not healing. It is avoidance. The opera will sing again, but let its walls remember the hush that followed Delacroix's scream. The train whistled, the countryside giving way now to gentle hills and villages. Poirot leaned back in his seat, steepling his fingers. I have solved many murders, Hastings. Some are gruesome, some are petty, and some are so bizarre as to defy explanation. But this one, he paused, this one reminds me why I began. Not to chase glory. Not to impress the press. But to preserve what is fragile in humanity, truth. He looked out the window again. We lie to each other, Hastings. Every day. Small lies, grand lies, desperate lies. But when those lies take root, when they become the air we breathe, someone like Anna Weiss is born. Hastings said nothing for a while. The cadence of the train maintained its pleasant beat, the wheels singing faintly as the kilometers went past. Poirot turned once again to his friend. Do you remember what she said at the end? Hastings nodded. She said, this is where the curtain falls. Poirot smiled. Ah, but she was wrong. The curtain does not fall. Not for us. We go on, certainly. But the music, the truth, it continues, even when no one is listening. He stood and retrieved his valise from the rack above. "We shall disembark at Avignon," he said. "A small inn awaits us. With fresh bread, ripe apricots, and, if we are fortunate, silence." "And if we are not fortunate?" Hastings asked. Poirot grinned. "Then there will be a crime, and I will once again have cause to complain about the English breakfast." Hastings laughed, rising to his feet. As the train began to slow, and the landscape took on the warm, rustic glow of the south, the two men stepped into the corridor and made their way to the door. Outside, the platform was quiet. A breeze stirred the dust, and somewhere, a bell rang distantly. Poirot looked around the station, taking in the sunlit buildings, the flowers blooming in window boxes, and the smell of baked bread drifting on the air. He turned to Hastings and said softly, "It is good to be somewhere where no one is performing." "Except the birds," Hastings said. Poirot tipped his hat. "Ah, but nature never lies, mon ami. That is its greatest gift." Together, they walked away from the train, two silhouettes shrinking beneath the wide Provençal sky. Behind them, the case at the Palais Garnier, its masks, its murders, its music, remained not as legend, not as spectacle, but as understanding. A story not of blood alone, but of pain, memory, and the silent tragedies we carry behind the velvet curtains of our lives. And somewhere, far behind them, a soprano's voice soared once more through the arches of the opera house, rising, clear and tragic, into the echo of eternity. For all its glamour and theatricality, Paris was a city that forgot quickly. By the time 2 weeks had passed since the events at the Palais Garnier, the scandal was no longer the headline. The newspapers had turned their gaze toward politics, a minor banking controversy, and an affair involving a famous novelist. The opera house, meanwhile, stood proudly beneath the spring sun, its facade scrubbed clean, as though the murder of Estelle Delacroix had been just another performance, already fading into myth, but not for Hercule Poirot. He had returned to the opera house that morning, alone, dressed impeccably in a dove-gray suit and navy blue tie. A boutonniere peeked delicately from his lapel. His shoes clicked softly along the marbled foyer, their shine immaculate as ever. The house was closed to the public today, no rehearsals, no performances. "Just be quiet." Poirot paused beneath the big chandelier, tipping his head back slightly to view the ceiling. Marc Chagall's floating figures danced above him. Violinists, dreamers, and angels suspended in impossible flight. It was a painting of pure joy, and yet it was beneath this exact ceiling that a lady had pleaded for her life, and no one had come in time. From the empty orchestra pit came the gentle scuff of a footstep. "Bonjour, Monsieur Poirot," murmured a voice behind him. He turned. It was Madame Lefebvre, the newly appointed director of the opera house. A tall woman in her 50s, stern but fair, with intelligent eyes and graying hair swept into a tidy chignon. "I wasn't expecting you," she said. Poirot offered a polite smile. "It is a habit of mine, madam, to return to the scene of a crime, not for the purpose of investigation, but for understanding. I do not believe in ghosts, but I do believe in echoes." She stepped closer, arms crossed lightly. "You solved it. That's what matters." Poirot's expression remained neutral. "Does it?" There was silence for a moment as they both gazed up at the painted sky above them. "I read Anna Weiss's letter," Lefebvre said softly. "The one she sent to the board before her arrest. It was powerful. She wrote not to condemn," Poirot said, "but to explain. She had no illusions of forgiveness." "She won't be forgotten," Lefebvre said. "No," Poirot agreed. "Nor should she be." They stood in silence for a moment, as dust motes danced lazily through shafts of morning light. Lefebvre turned to him. "Did she do it all alone, do you think?" Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "No. She had help. She had pain. She had memory. She had a city full of people who refused to listen. But the act, the choice, that was hers. And the others? Some were complicit by action. Some by silence. And some," Poirot said, "by cowardice." Lefebvre looked toward the stage. I've spent my life in opera, Monsieur Poirot. And I've seen performers destroy themselves for a role. I used to think tragedy was something confined to the stage. Now I know it's everywhere, just better costumed. Poirot nodded slowly. That is the truth. And yet, it is only in the theater where tragedy is allowed to finish. To resolve. In life, we are not given that same gift. We tolerate the unfinished. He glanced down at the polished floor beneath them, then back up at the stage. There is one thing that still concerns me, he said quietly. What's that? Poirot turned his eyes toward the private boxes. The scream. It was not only fear. It was a warning. A last, desperate attempt to tell us something. Lefebvre frowned. What could she have warned us of? Poirot said nothing for a long moment. Then, ultimately, he shook his head. Perhaps, only that truth always finds its voice. Even if it must die to be heard. Later that day, Poirot returned to his apartment. Hastings was waiting, dressed for travel, a suitcase at his feet, all packed, he announced. I took the liberty of reserving us 2 rooms at the Auberge du Vallon in Avignon. I've heard the food's fantastic, and the sole entertainment is a puppet performance once a week. Poirot gave a small smile. And no murders, you are sure? Hastings chuckled. If there are, they'll have to wait until after the apricot tart. Poirot stepped into the room, glanced at the tidy stack of letters on his writing desk, each one a chapter of the case, and placed a final note on top. A letter from Anna Weiss's solicitor, confirming her decision not to appeal. No plea for sympathy. No claim of reduced capacity. She had signed it simply, for the record that he picked it up, studied it, and then slid it into a manila folder marked opera. I suppose we won't be seeing her again, Hastings said gently. No, Poirot replied. But I believe she has already been seen, more clearly than ever before. He looked to Hastings. Come. We have a train to catch. The train to Avignon sped southward, the windows blurring with the rush of countryside, vineyards, lavender fields, and small cottages nestled between gentle hills. It was a far cry from the vaulted ceilings and masked whispers of the opera house. Poirot reclined in his seat, fingers steepled, eyes closed, not in sleep but in thought. Hastings sat beside him, reading aloud from the vacation brochure. The Auberge du Vallon offers peace and quiet for the tired soul. Simple meals, good wine, no distractions. Sounds like paradise, doesn't it? Poirot smiled faintly but said nothing. As the train curved through a field of sunflowers, Hastings lowered the brochure and looked at his friend. You did good work, Poirot. It wasn't an easy case. Not morally, I mean. Poirot opened his eyes. It is never easy, Hastings, when the crime is rooted in silence. It is significantly easier to pursue the murderer who acts in passion, or greed, or envy. But when the motive is memory, then we are dealing with something far older than guilt. Hastings nodded. Still, justice was done. Poirot looked out the window. Indeed. But justice, like opera, is a matter of time. Too soon, and it is revenge. Too late, and it is a tragedy. But at just the right moment, it is truth. The train continued its journey. The sun began to dip, pouring golden light across the tracks, bathing everything in the warm glow of an ending. Poirot folded his hands in his lap. Do you know why I love the opera, Hastings? I assumed it was the order. The structure. Partly, Poirot said. But also because it reveals something most people hide, that even the most elegant of performances is built upon tension. That beauty comes not from peace, but from restraint. And when that restraint breaks, the voice rises. High. Pure. Unbearable. He paused, and sometimes, necessary. They fell into a companionable silence. As Avignon came into view, a bell chimed in the distance, and the train slowed. Poirot picked up his valise and stood. Come, mon ami. We will take our rest. And if there are no crimes, perhaps we shall solve the mystery of who bakes the best tarte aux figs in Provence. Hastings grinned. That's a case I'm happy to investigate. They stepped off the train and into the golden Provençal evening. Birds circled high above. Children ran along the platform, chasing shadows. The aroma of rosemary and citrus flowed on the breeze, and as they went toward the village inn, the distant sound of church bells sounded the hour, not an end. Not a beginning, but a perfect moment in between. A curtain drawn, not in mourning, but in grace. A night at the opera, interrupted by murder. Welcome to Detective Echoes. I am your host Joshua. This community is built on curiosity. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments. Seeing your responses makes each story come alive. Here we go. One poison note, one vanished killer, and Poirot must hear the truth behind the lies. I'm William, your host, and we're creating something incredible. Please leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hearing from you all is essential. Let's get started. The Parisian elite assembled under the crimson drapes and golden chandeliers of the Palais Garnier on a particularly clear March evening. Outside, the city glowed in the gaslight, and the Seine rippled with its reflections. Renowned soprano Isabella Ferrier's return to the role of Violetta in La Traviata sparked a more sophisticated anticipation that simmered inside. The audience, a representation of high society, had gathered in full splendor. Silk gloves clung to aristocratic fingers, diamonds glittered on baronesses' necks, and the aroma of pricey perfumes blended subtly with that of polished wood and old velvet. Hercule Poirot, seated in the luxury of Box 12, watched it all with a measured calm. Paris had turned out not just for the opera but also for a social event. Whispers of politics, courtship, and scandal circulated as smoothly as champagne in intermission lounges. His mustache, a marvel of symmetry, was waxed with geometric precision, his patent leather shoes were flawlessly polished, and his pocket square was neatly folded. "You are not attending to the music, Hastings," Poirot said softly, without looking up. Captain Arthur Hastings, sitting next to him, shifted uneasily in his chair, craning his neck at the balconies and gallery above. Hastings began a little. "Poirot, I must admit that I find it difficult to follow the plot of these operas. Why does everyone have to perish in the end?" With a faint smile, Poirot brushed away an invisible speck from his cuff. "Because, mon ami, human foolishness ends in tragedy rather than with reason. In both the opera and real life, the heart often serves as a more perilous weapon than a knife." Hastings started to reply, but the growing tension in the orchestra pit cut him off. The climax of the second act was drawing near. Isabella Ferrier, radiant and passionate, sang on stage with such passion that even Poirot, who prefers order to drama, appeared momentarily moved. The scream, which was not a part of the performance, came after a moment of silence, as if even the Palais Garnier itself held its breath. It cut like a blade through the soaring soprano aria, and it was too raw and jagged. The bows scraped the chords as the ensemble faltered. The baton was in midair when the conductor froze. Subsequently, there was a heavy, strange silence that rippled outward from a specific box. Everybody looked up. A shuffling motion came from Box 5, a notorious loge in Parisian legend that has long been connected to superstition and whispered ghost stories. The gloved hand of a woman clutched the velvet railing, twitching frantically before slipping. The audience gasped as her body sagged forward, a lifeless silhouette against the dark golden sconces. A voice yelled, "Un docteur! Vite!" An usher, breathless and white-faced, rushed through the grand foyer doors amid the ensuing confusion. "There is a murder. A woman est morte." No libretto could have predicted the chaos that erupted in the Palais in a matter of seconds. People were standing perplexed. The lights in the home came on. A tall, military-clad man attempted to push toward the box with a lack of authority. Performers and stagehands looked out from backstage, their costumes grotesquely out of place with the horror that was taking place. Hastings stood looking horrified. "Oh my God, Poirot, do you think?" With his eyes narrowed in unsettling composure, Poirot muttered, "I guess, Hastings, that Mademoiselle Ferrier won't be making her farewell bow tonight. However, someone else, someone less dramatic, has made her farewell appearance." He stood up and made his customary adjustments to his coat. "We must go to that box," he added, already heading toward their own exit, but his expression was one of curiosity and an almost imperceptible tightening of his gaze rather than panic or surprise. "Yes, there has been a death, but I don't believe it was due to natural causes. And if it is murder, mon ami, it has been orchestrated with the nuance of an overture." Poirot moved through the swarming crowd with unexpected speed, slipping between the rich and the anxious like a man pursuing a secret path. When they arrived at the corridor outside Box 5, they saw a scene of controlled panic. The gilded staircases, which are usually places of elegance and flirtation, now bore hurried feet and voices raised not in gossip but in alarm. The theater manager, Renaud, a pale and sweating man, was being conferred with by two clumsy gendarmes. They had already called a doctor. "Messieurs, this area must remain closed," the younger gendarme started, but Poirot brushed past him with the authority of a man who never raised his voice but was somehow always obeyed. "I am Hercule Poirot," he said calmly, "and I suggest you do not waste time arguing with me when a life has been lost." The box's interior was hidden behind a curtain, behind which a shadowed figure sat motionless and motionless. "Or would you rather the press in Paris accuse the police of procedurally postponing justice?" Flustered, the gendarme moved aside. Sensing the seriousness in his companion's demeanor, Hastings followed, now silent. The atmosphere inside the box was oppressive. The noise outside was muffled by the heavy curtain. The victim's exquisite evening gown continued to catch the light as she sat slouched in an elaborate chair. Her glassy, wide eyes stared at something far away from the opera. The expression on her face was one of surprise rather than pain, so complete that it appeared to have silenced her soul. Poirot leaned to study the scene. He kept a close eye on the body but never touched it. No blood. No violent signs at first. He whispered, "Cyanide," with a hint of red at the corners of his lips and the distinct smell of bitter almonds. "Be quick. Effective. Not to mention theatrical." Hastings grimaced, "This is not amateur work. Are you familiar with her?" Poirot gave a nod. "Estelle Delacroix, madame. Just got back from Vienna. She was the widow of the late shipping magnate Philippe Delacroix and a well-known patron of the arts. She was well known for both her wealth and her quarrels." He straightened. "And she wasn't just here for social reasons tonight. This was no accident, Hastings." The doctor came in, verified the death, and left with a shake of his head. "Tell me, Monsieur Renaud, who else was seated in this box with Madame Delacroix?" Poirot turned back to the theater manager, who appeared to prefer to be anywhere else. Renaud paused. "No one, sir. She was by herself. She frequently made private box reservations." "Alone?" Poirot furrowed his brow. "Still, she let out a scream. Women do not scream unless they are frightened or startled. She wasn't by herself. There was a visitor." Hastings looked around the chair nervously. "Where did they go, though?" "That, Hastings," Poirot said abruptly, "is what we must find." Everyone's attention was drawn when there was a loud knock on the box door. Hesitantly, a tall, pale, and shaky woman came in. I'm sorry. I might meet someone here, I was told. My name is Anna Weiss. I work as Miss Ferrier's assistant. I simply noticed something." Prior to the scream, Poirot took a cautious step forward. "Enter, mademoiselle. And kindly share what you witnessed with me." Poirot listened intently as the young woman started talking, taking in every detail. Behind his eyes, a flash of recognition appeared. It appeared that the opera was still going on. Not quite yet. The overture was just getting started for Hercule Poirot. Tension filled the Palais Garnier's backstage hallways. A more subdued drama, one of fear rather than love or sacrifice, was now unfolding in the shadows beneath the thick silence of velvet curtains and golden cornices. Stagehands and vocalists spoke to one another like ghostly echoes, and the typical smell of theatrical grease paint and face powder had been replaced by something tighter and colder, dread. Hercule Poirot glided among them like a man putting together a chessboard. Captain Arthur Hastings walked beside him, his shoulders rigid, his eyes wandering. Every look, every detail was recorded, saved, and weighed. Not with the frantic panic of the gendarmes, but with the poise of someone who already suspected the game's rules, even if he did not yet know the players. Amazing, he whispered. A woman was poisoned while performing in one of the city's most prestigious venues, and nobody noticed who did it? Yeah, but somebody did, Poirot muttered. Or maybe a lot of people did, and are still unaware of it. They entered a small anteroom just past the wings, where the young woman who had introduced herself as Anna Weiss sat clutching a teacup she had hardly touched. In crimes like these, mon ami, the truth is like a melody, hidden beneath the harmony of lies. She had the straight posture of someone who had been trained in the arts, and she appeared to be no more than 25 years old. Her cheek had a dark curl that had fallen out of her bun. She appeared to be caught between fear and something more elusive, like remorse or confusion. Poirot sat across from her, his hands folded neatly on his lap. "Now, mademoiselle," he said calmly, "you told us that you saw something before the scream. I want you to go over it again, slowly, starting at the beginning." Anna nodded and swallowed. I was in the hallway leading to the private rooms. I frequently stay there for the second act. Just in case I'm called upon at any time." "Of course," Poirot nodded. She smiled slightly and said, "That is the mark of a dedicated understudy. I was actually just outside of box 5. I could see movement even though I wasn't looking in. I recall seeing a man. Shortly before the scream, he stepped out of the box." Poirot leaned forward. "A man? Tall? Brief? Young?" Anna scowled as she tried to remember. "Not very tall. Moderately built. He was dressed in a dark coat, either black or navy. And, low over the eyes, a hat. I couldn't see his face clearly. It was swift. Was he moving in a composed manner? In a hurry? He did not run," she remarked. "However, he made deliberate movements. He wasn't wasting time either." Poirot gave a contemplative nod. "And you witnessed him emerge from the box itself? Not just strolling along the hallway?" "Yes," Anna said in agreement. "I'm positive." Hastings interrupted, "It's strange that nobody else noticed him. Ushers and gendarmes were present." "Not so strange, Hastings," Poirot remarked. "The seconds after a gunshot are similar to the moments after a scream." He turned back to Anna. "Everyone is focused on the sound, not the source. Did Madame Delacroix come by herself to the opera?" "I'm not sure," she said. "However, she was alone herself in the box all the time. She reportedly refused company, saying it spoiled the sound." Poirot stood, his thoughts evidently shifting with subdued intensity. "Mademoiselle Mary, you have been very helpful." Hastings trailed behind Poirot back into the hallway as a stage assistant gently escorted Anna away. "You think the man she saw is our killer?" They went back to the gilded lobby, where Charite Inspector Jules Masson was waiting for them. "Let us say," Poirot whispered, "he is no less interesting than the scream that followed him." Masson, a stern man with steel-buttoned eyes and a broad nose, did not appear pleased. "Poirot," he said in a clipped voice. "They say you were there. That means you want to take over, I guess." Poirot bowed modestly. "Absolutely not," Inspector. As always, I only plan to help with the utmost humility and concern for the truth. Humph, Masson grunted. We have started interrogating the employees and customers. Only the scream, followed by the commotion, caught everyone's attention. You would think that in a packed theater, someone might have caught a murderer in the act. Poirot grinned softly. You think the killer slipped away, but I don't. Masson blinked. What are you saying? It's possible, my dear inspector, that the murderer did not go away into the night and is still among us. He then asked for a list of everyone who had a box reserved that evening, particularly those closest to box 5, saying, and if that is so, we must examine not only the crime but also the company. Renaud, the manager of the Palais Garnier, produced a gilded ledger with trembling fingers. Countess Elena Markova, a Russian émigré famous for her beauty and sharp wit, had been living in box 4. Sir Reginald Wilmarth, the British ambassador, and his wife had been in box 6. Poirot's brows tightened as he read. Signor Vincenzo Bellini, an Italian entrepreneur, sat nearby in box 8. He was not the composer, but he did encourage the mistake. Let's talk to them. One by one. Countess Markova, who had not yet left the theater, was the target of their first visit. She had a cigarette between two lazy fingers, cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, and was dazzling in emeralds. Oh yes, she said coolly, releasing a stream of smoke. The scream reached my ears. Horrible noise. Like a cat being choked. And you didn't see anything out of the ordinary before that? I noticed everything, Monsieur Poirot, she said, with a hint of irony in her voice, in response to Poirot's question. I have a habit of doing that. It was exactly 10 minutes before curtain time that I witnessed Madame Delacroix enter. As usual, she went inside her box by herself. However, during the second act, I did notice another person, someone bending over the back of the box. I think he's a man. What would you say about him? No. Just a shadow. If my memory is correct, he left right before the scream. Hastings shot Poirot a glare. Anna's statement was confirmed. Sir Reginald Wilmarth was then called upon. I cannot see what possible relevance I have to this affair, the agitated diplomat said, his face flushed with outrage. Indeed, I did hear a scream. My spouse passed out. Our contribution was limited to that. But your box is adjacent, Sir Reginald, Poirot said. You might have noticed something without understanding its importance, complained Wilmarth. In box 5, there was movement. However, Monsieur Poirot, people move. It isn't against the law. And you didn't hear? Just the show. Until that scream. Poirot bowed his head courteously. Finally, they addressed Signor Bellini, who was as opulent as one might anticipate. Ah, such tragedy. Merci, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. He said, making wild gestures. Right in the art house. Madame Delacroix was with me. She's had wine with me. Music is having a bad day. Before asking his question, Poirot let him perform. During the performance, did you witness anyone getting in or out of her box? Bellini hesitated. Don't go in. However, I noticed a young man in the hallway. Shaven. Uneasy, looking around. Just before the second act started, he approached box 5. You would recognize him again? Maybe, Bellini remarked. If I saw him. Poirot turned back to Hastings in the silence of the hallway. You see, Hastings, the notes are starting to harmonize. 3 witnesses, 3 different men, all linked to the same instant. However, everyone has a slightly different perspective on him. Isn't that normal? Maybe. Poirot stopped again in front of the closed door of box 5. Let us leave the stage, Hastings, he said quietly, implying that it is not the man who changes but rather the lens through which he is viewed. The actual opera is about to start, and its actors are gathering in the wings. By morning, the Palais Garnier's opulence appeared strangely muted, as if the opera house itself was lamenting the loss it had seen. The jubilant echoes of performance had vanished beneath its domes and statuary, and the slow, shuffling presence of investigation had taken their place in the air. Hercule Poirot arrived on time at 9 o'clock, his hat straight and his gloves immaculate. Sunlight shone through stained glass in the big entryway, creating colored patches on the marble floor where the exquisite shoes of the previous evening had walked. There was no sign of weariness in his manner, even though he had not gone back to his apartment on the Rue des Capucines until the early hours of the morning. When a puzzle came up, Poirot considered sleep to be a luxury rather than a necessity. He met Hastings at the opera house's front steps, where the captain was waiting with his coat turned up against the morning chill. "I don't like this one, Poirot," Hastings said without introducing himself. "It seems strange." Before the crime, there was no threat. No obvious suspects. Simply one deceased woman and an unidentified man disappearing into the crowd. "Yeah, but that's exactly what I like, Hastings," Poirot said pleasantly. "I'm interested in the quiet crimes, the subtle ones. They need the mind, not the eye." He lightly tapped his temple with a gloved finger. "And I have brought my most polished grey cells today." Inspector Masson, who appeared more gaunt than he had the previous evening, welcomed them inside. He presented Poirot with a folder. Initial remarks. Although no murder weapon was found, the medical examiner confirms that cyanide was used. Poirot scowled. "Quick, deadly, no time to scream." "She did scream, though." Masson blinked. "Exactly. I'm confused by it." Poirot nodded slowly. "Then, we need to know what makes a woman scream just before she dies from a poison that doesn't give her that chance." They started with a return to the crime scene. Masson gave him a perplexed look, but Poirot had already turned to the task at hand. Maybe the scream was not from pain, but recognition. Although Poirot had been given unfettered access at the theatre board's request, Box 5 was now sealed off. An island of finality in the luxurious surroundings, the chair in which Madame Delacroix had passed away was still in place. Poirot moved carefully, looking at the edges rather than the obvious. Hastings watched him in silence until Poirot turned abruptly. "She did not come here to enjoy the music, Hastings." "How do you mean?" He ran a hand along the velvet railing, checked the corners of the box, and even bent to examine a discarded opera program that had fallen behind a seat. The program was delayed by Poirot. Unopened. There were no creases, and no notes were present. She was a woman of habit, consistently attentive and keeping track of her scores. She came here for another reason. He went to the little cabinet next to the box's private entrance and opened it. There was a small drawer with opera glasses, a chilled section where champagne could be stored, and nothing else. "No gloves," Poirot said, his eyes narrowing. "No purse." Wondering if she could have left them somewhere else. She was never irresponsible. "No, they were taken, Hastings. Or she purposefully left them elsewhere. Today, he limps." But the man Weber saw walked with confidence. He forgot which role he was playing. And with that, Poirot turned away from the scene, not toward the exit, but toward the stage, where a rehearsal had quietly resumed. "For some," he said softly, "the show must go on. But for others, the curtain has fallen." The following day, a rare warmth settled over Paris, but the sun did little to lift the chill that lingered in the hearts of those connected to the Palais Garnier. The opera house had resumed its daily routine, rehearsals, repairs, polite conversation in the director's office, but beneath it all, unease simmered. Vincenzo Bellini, once the darling impresario of the opera circuit, had been taken into custody for the murder of Estelle Delacroix. And yet, Hercule Poirot was not satisfied that he paused once more in the dressing-room corridor, his gaze far away, the fragrance of grease paint and dust heavy in the air. Hastings stood beside him, arms folded and brow creased with concern. "Well, I must say, Poirot," Hastings said, "if Bellini didn't do it, I'd be shocked." Everything pointed to him. The coat. The monogrammed handkerchief. The threat to his career. Even his confession. "Oui," Poirot replied softly, "and that is what bothers me." Hastings blinked. "You're saying, it was too perfect?" Poirot turned to him. "It was theatrical, Hastings. Bellini performed for us. Not just during the opera, but during the interrogation. He admitted guilt, but what if he did not confess to murder but to his greatest fear, exposure? A man like Bellini, dramatic, proud, might accept the blame for a scandal he can understand. But he might not even realize he has been manipulated." Hastings exhaled. "So we're back where we started?" "Non. We are further along than ever." Poirot moved toward the stage, which was now under slow transformation for the next production. Carpenters and lighting men bustled softly. He stepped past them, ignoring their polite nods, and stopped at center stage. There, he slowly turned and looked up, his eyes scanning every row, every box, every flicker of space in which a secret could hide. Then, abruptly, he looked down. "Hastings," he said suddenly, "do you remember what Franz Weber said about the confrontation? That someone else entered the box as he was leaving?" "Oui." "And remember what he said about Delacroix's threat? How she was going to expose more than just one man?" Hastings nodded slowly. "She mentioned the board." Poirot knelt by the edge of the stage, running a finger across the painted floor. "Exactly. Bellini was part of the board. But he was not alone. Who else had as much to lose if Delacroix had gone public? And more crucially, who had the means to point the blame directly at Bellini? You think he was framed?" "I think," Poirot said, rising, "that someone composed this murder like a symphony. Layered, timed, and elegant. And Bellini was merely the opening movement." They returned to the administrative wing, where Poirot requested a private meeting with the chairman of the opera's board, Jean-Luc Moreau. A solitary guy in his 50s, Moreau had remained notably quiet during the investigation. Poirot, ever vigilant, had taken note. The boardroom was a stark contrast to the grandiose theater. Here, glass and oak replaced gold and velvet. Moreau sat at the long table, a cup of black coffee beside him, his face tired but unreadable. "Monsieur Poirot," he said in greeting. "To what do I owe this visit? I was under the impression the case had been solved." Poirot bowed slightly. "The gendarmes believe it has. But I have learned to trust my discomfort, monsieur, and that tells me there is still more beneath the surface." Moreau sighed and folded his hands. "Please, ask your questions." "You have known Madame Delacroix for many years." We were both part of the board. She was passionate, difficult, and terribly proud. Did she confide in you?" Moreau hesitated. "How about?" Poirot smiled gently. "About the forgery scandal in Vienna. About Bellini's role. About others involved." Now Moreau's eyes narrowed slightly. "She was considering making it public. I tried to dissuade her. We all did." "We?" "The other board members. Myself. Renaud. Even the conductor, Vasseur. She was going to drag us all through the mud for something that happened years ago." Poirot tilted his head. "So you admit you had a motive?" "I admit," Moreau said carefully, "that we feared what she might say. But that doesn't make me a murderer." "Non," Poirot said. "But it may make you a composer." Moreau's brow furrowed. "You see, Monsieur Moreau," Poirot continued, "this crime was orchestrated. Bellini was led into that box, knowing she would confront him. Knowing he would panic. But someone else poisoned her drink, someone who knew Bellini would be blamed. Do you have proof of this fantasy? Poirot reached into his coat and produced a small envelope. In Madame Delacroix's handbag, found not in her box, but hidden behind a curtain in the corridor, we discovered this. It is a receipt. Dated 2 weeks prior. For a private storage unit rented under a false name, Gloria. A name with no history, no trace. And? The storage unit contained records. Original artworks. Letters. Documents connecting not just Bellini to the Vienna fraud, but others. Yourself included. Renaud. Even Maestro Vasseur. Moreau's face went pale. You see, monsieur, Poirot said softly, Madame Delacroix was not just threatening a scandal. She was assembling a dossier. And she meant to deliver it. Someone ensured that dossier would never reach its destination. There was silence. Then Moreau's voice, thin and bitter. Do you have any idea what would have happened if she had gone to the press? To the Ministry of Culture? The entire institution would have collapsed. And so you sacrificed one woman to preserve it? Moreau said nothing. Poirot stepped closer. Did you poison her yourself, monsieur? No, Moreau said quietly. But I knew she would confront Bellini that night. And I knew someone else, someone colder than I, would do what I could not. Who? There was a long pause. Then, Maestro Vasseur. Poirot turned to Hastings. The conductor. Moreau's voice came again, hoarse now. He has influence in every corner of this house. He came to me after a board meeting and said it was time to resolve the Delacroix problem. I didn't ask how. Poirot nodded slowly. Then it is time we speak to the maestro. They found Vasseur in the orchestra pit, rehearsing a chamber piece with a skeleton crew. A thin man with silver hair and sharp features, he conducted with brisk precision. When he saw Poirot approach, he held up a hand to silence the musicians and dismissed them with a tight smile. Monsieur Poirot, he said. To what do I owe the interruption? Maestro, Poirot said gently, did you poison Estelle Delacroix? Vasseur's expression did not change. A bold question. And one you expected. There was a pause. Then Vasseur nodded slowly. Yes, he said. Hastings gasped. You admit it? I admit to preserving this institution from ruin, Vasseur replied. She was ready to unravel everything. Do you know what this house means to Paris? To music? A scandal would have crippled us for a generation. Poirot shook his head sadly. And so you laced her champagne with cyanide. Let Bellini take the fall. I knew he would panic. He was guilty of enough. I simply accelerated the end. Poirot said nothing for a long moment. Then he stepped aside, allowing Inspector Masson and his officers, who had waited quietly in the wings, to take the maestro into custody. As Vasseur was led away, head held high, Poirot looked up into the darkened rows of the empty theatre, and so, he said softly, the opera concludes. Not with a crescendo, but a silence. Hastings touched his arm. You look troubled. Poirot nodded. Because I have uncovered the truth, yes. But also because I have seen how far the heart will go, not for love, but for reputation. They stood together as the house lights dimmed, leaving only the ghostly gleam of chandeliers swaying above. Somewhere, unseen, a curtain fell. It was nearly midnight when Hercule Poirot returned to his flat on the Rue des Capucines. He removed his hat with meticulous care, brushing off a single drop of lingering drizzle that clung to the brim, and strode across the threshold with the serene grace of a man carrying more than the weight of the day. Hastings followed closely behind, noticeably more agitated, still turning over the events of the evening in his mind. He admitted it, Poirot. I heard it with my own ears, Hastings insisted as he removed his coat. Maestro Vasseur poisoned Madame Delacroix, and Moreau all but confessed to conspiring in it. What more could you possibly need? Poirot, immaculate as ever, walked to the sitting room and gently placed his gloves on the small brass tray near the door. "What I need, Hastings," he replied, "is what I have always needed. Symmetry. Harmony. You see, even a confession must sit comfortably with the facts. And Vasseurs does not." Hastings stared. But it all aligns. He had access. Motive. The means. He knew about poisons, for heaven's sake. They said he once trained as a pharmacist before becoming a conductor. Poirot gave a small, appreciative nod. "Oui, a detail that could fool even the most discerning eye. But there is one detail, mon ami, that Vasseur could not fake, one that sits at the heart of the matter. And it is why I know the good maestro did not act alone, or possibly not at all." Poirot walked to the sideboard, poured a small glass of crème de menthe, and sat down. "Sit, Hastings," he said softly. "Let us go over what we know, one final time." With a weary groan, Hastings obliged, taking his usual seat across from the little Belgian detective, though he had long learned to mistrust the word "final" when Poirot used it. Poirot continued. "Madame Delacroix was murdered with cyanide. Fast-acting. Tasteless, except for the faint bitterness that only an experienced palate would detect, and she, with her refined senses, may well have noticed it too late. But more crucial is this, no glass was recovered." "Ah yes," Hastings said. "The gendarmes searched for it. Must have been taken." "Exactly. That is not the action of a man like Vasseur, who believes himself above suspicion. He would not think to remove evidence. He would think himself too clever to need to. No, that is the hand of someone else, someone meticulous, someone who understands that no performance is complete without a well-managed stage." "You think he was protecting someone?" "I think," Poirot said, "he was directed." He stood suddenly and walked to his writing desk. From a drawer, he retrieved a set of photographs taken the night of the murder, crowd scenes, suspects, even the crime scene itself. Poirot laid them out carefully on the table. "Do you recall this image, Hastings?" he asked, pointing to a photograph of the opera corridor just after the scream. "It shows gendarmes, performers, and crew running into box 5. And in the backdrop, just visible, was a woman in a dark shawl." Hastings gazed at it. "That's Anna Weiss, isn't it? The understudy. She informed us she spotted the mysterious man, Franz Weber, leaving the box." Poirot tapped the figure. "Indeed. But look again. What is she holding?" Hastings squinted. "A handbag?" Poirot gave a nod. "And Madame Delacroix's handbag was not found in her box but behind a curtain in the corridor, the same corridor where Anna had been standing alone." For a long moment, Hastings said nothing. "You think Anna took it?" "I do," Poirot said quietly. "And that she planted the receipt in the handbag deliberately to lead us to the storage unit. She wanted us to find the dossier, but only after the right person had already been accused." "But why? What reason would she have to murder Delacroix? Or to frame Bellini?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Now, mon ami, you are asking the right question." He picked up another photograph, this one from years prior, pulled from Delacroix's personal papers by Masson's men. It showed a young woman, barely more than a girl, standing beside a stern-faced man and an elegant woman in evening attire. In the background was an art gallery in Vienna. "The girl," Poirot said, tapping the image. "That is Anna Weiss. And the man beside her is Emile Weiss, her father. A dealer who was ruined in the wake of the Delacroix-Bellini forgery scandal. His reputation destroyed, his galleries seized. He died penniless in Prague." Hastings sat upright. "Then she's not just an understudy." "No," Poirot said. "She is the child of a man destroyed by Delacroix's greed, by Bellini's lies, by the silence of the board. She had every reason to hate them. And the perfect cover, anonymity." Hastings blinked. "So, what are you saying?" That she killed Madame Delacroix to revenge her father? Not only that, Poirot said. She crafted a masterpiece of deception. She manipulated Weber's presence, used Bellini's guilt, and planted evidence that would point us toward Moreau and Vasseur, all to obscure her hand. Each suspect was played like an instrument in her opera of vengeance. There was a silence between them, punctuated only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock. And now? Hastings asked finally. Now, Poirot said, we return to the Palais Garnier. The performance is not yet over. By early morning, Poirot and Hastings were once more at the Opera House. Anna Weiss had been summoned under the pretense of providing further information. She arrived with careful poise, her expression neutral, her voice even. I hope I've been helpful to the investigation, she said, hands clasped in front of her. Poirot gestured to the velvet chairs at the edge of the stage. Indeed, mademoiselle. You have. And now, I must ask you to take your place for the final act. She hesitated, her brow furrowing. I don't understand. Poirot stepped forward. No one ever looked at you twice, mademoiselle. That was your great strength. You were always there, but never noticed. The understudy. The shadow. The girl behind the music. And that is how you managed to kill Estelle Delacroix. Anna paled. Monsieur Poirot, he raised a hand. Let me speak. You found Franz Weber in the records. Knew he would draw attention. You enticed Delacroix back into contact with him, expecting to arouse her rage. You prepared the poison. You intercepted her before she entered her box, pretending to return a borrowed shawl, perhaps. Just long enough to slip the poison into her glass or bottle. Then you stepped aside and waited for the scream. Afterward, you planted the false trail, just enough to lead us to Bellini, then Moreau and Vasseur. Everyone who had wronged your family. Anna stood perfectly still. Poirot walked slowly around her, his voice gentle but unrelenting. It was not madness that drove you, it was orchestration. You are not simply a singer, mademoiselle. You are a conductor. And this was your opera. Anna turned to face him. Her voice, when it came, was steady. She killed him. My father. Not with a gun or a knife, but with lies. She and Bellini made a fortune while my family was ruined. And everyone else stood by. Poirot bowed his head. I do not deny your pain. But vengeance, mademoiselle, is never justice, it is only another tragedy. The doors opened behind them. Inspector Masson stepped forward, flanked by officers. Anna turned to Poirot one last time. I suppose this is where the curtain falls. Poirot gave a small, sorrowful nod. No, mademoiselle. This is where the lights go up. And with quiet dignity, Anna Weiss was taken away, not screaming, not struggling, but as if stepping from the stage after her final bow. The opera house was empty now, not just silent, as it had been before performances or during rehearsals, but empty in that profound, echoing way that comes only after something has ended. It had been 3 days since Anna Weiss had been arrested, and the Palais Garnier had temporarily closed its doors, not for scandal or shame, but in the name of reflection. The performance of La Traviata would resume the following week. Life, as always, would continue, and yet, Hercule Poirot remained. He sat alone in the grand foyer, his gloved hands folded neatly on his cane, his eyes fixed on the great mirror that lined the far wall. The room glowed with soft afternoon light filtering through high arched windows, illuminating gold and marble and a ghostly quiet. Above, the painted ceiling, angels and muses locked in eternal rapture, watched over him with unmoving judgment. Poirot, however, saw none of it. He saw only people. Hastings entered the foyer, walking quietly across the polished floor. He'd just returned from meeting with Inspector Masson at the Prefecture de Police. A stack of official reports and transcripts rested beneath his arm. Any news from the Charite? Poirot asked without looking up. Hastings nodded, setting the documents on a nearby table. Indeed. Anna Weiss has made a full confession. Calm, composed, she admitted to everything. The poisoning, the planted evidence, the manipulation of witnesses. Said she'd been planning it for years. Poirot's mouth drew into a tight line. A murder that began as a child's memory. How old was she when her father fell from grace? 9, Hastings said. Old enough to remember the auction. The scandal. The silence. Poirot turned slightly, his eyes never leaving the reflection in the mirror. And so, for 15 years, she nursed a wound that festered in silence. Such grief, mon ami, such solitude. He stood and paced slowly across the room. You see, Hastings, Anna did not merely kill Estelle Delacroix. She orchestrated a tragedy in the classical sense. Each act, each player, each revelation, calculated. And yet, he paused, she allowed herself to be caught. Hastings frowned. She didn't flee. She didn't fight. She told the truth, in the end. Poirot nodded. Indeed. Because she wanted it to end. She had no plan beyond vengeance. Hers was not a life meant to continue after justice, only until. Hastings sat down. And the others? Bellini, Moreau, Vasseur, what will become of them? Moreau has resigned, Poirot said. Bellini faces charges for fraud, but he may escape with exile. And Vasseur, though the poison was not his, was complicit in concealing the truth. He will never conduct again in France. He gestured toward the vaulted ceiling. And the Palais Garnier? It will endure. It always has. That is the tragedy and beauty of institutions, Hastings, they persist, even when the people inside are broken. A silence fell between them. Then Hastings questioned, do you think Anna truly believed what she did was right? Poirot turned, his gaze distant. I think she believed no one else would ever hold them accountable. And she was not entirely wrong. The world has never known how to deal with quiet villains, mon ami. Only the noisy ones. He picked up one of the reports and flipped through it slowly. There is something more, Hastings. Something that bothers me still. Hastings blinked. What could possibly remain unresolved? Poirot held up a single photograph, one taken from a surveillance camera near the north exit of the Opera House. It showed Anna Weiss slipping away immediately after the murder, a handbag beneath her coat. But beside her, almost obscured in the shadows, was another figure, a man, unidentified. His face turned away. They returned to the dressing rooms, where singers and other artists were still present, rehearsals being hampered by the murder's announcement. Though there were still shadows in her eyes, Anna Weiss, the understudy who had reported the enigmatic guy, greeted them with greater assurance this time when Poirot asked to speak with her again. Monsieur Poirot, she said. Has anything progressed? Some. I'll be back with a couple more questions. Did Madame Delacroix know anyone in the company? Tell me, mademoiselle. Anna paused. Not very well. She stayed away from the audience, not the actors. However, yes? Anna bit her lip. She and Isabella once got into a heated argument. The others claimed it happened during a rehearsal a few months ago, but I wasn't present. Something about Isabella's failure to respect the legacy of her late husband. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Oh. So they were at odds with each other? Yes, but nobody really brought it up. Isabella is difficult to get past. Hastings leaned closer. Are you jealous? Perhaps, Anna said. One significant donor was Madame Delacroix. If she so desired, she could destroy a singer's career. Did she have a reason? I don't know. But it was a real fight. It was even heard by the conductor. Poirot nodded. I believe that calls for a discussion with Mademoiselle Ferrier. They discovered Isabella Ferrier in her dressing room, enveloped in silence and flowers. Her features were striking, and her poise was carefully controlled. She was in her early 30s. She greeted Poirot coolly, dressed in a smart grey suit rather than a costume. "I guess you're here to ask if I murdered Estelle Delacroix." "Would it be so strange if I were?" she asked. Poirot sat down and inquired. She raised a flawless eyebrow and said, "After all, you were among the last to see her alive." "I was singing. Among 1,000 people. Obviously. Nevertheless, the boxes are confidential. There is no security in the hallways. Many people may have the opportunity. But why? It is more difficult to hide that." Isabella shrugged. "Yes, we had a fight. She thought I was ungrateful for her patronage and that I had forgotten my roots. Maybe I was. However, I didn't poison her." "Did she make any threats?" "No. Only disapproval. However, Estelle's disapproval might end your career." Poirot researched her. "Are you familiar with the name Franz Weber?" Isabella's mouth opened, and her eyes briefly revealed something, recognition, which was swiftly covered up. "Franz?" She spoke slowly. "No. I don't think so." "Weird," Poirot remarked kindly. "Because the letters discovered in Madame Delacroix's apartment contain numerous instances of his name. Next to yours." She tensed. Poirot grinned and said, "So you know more than you're letting on." He left her with that, walking back into the hallway with Hastings at his heels. "That, mademoiselle, is always the case." "What now?" "Now," Poirot remarked, "we discover why a woman who lived with such discipline made an unexpected, lethal visit to the opera," Hastings inquired. "And what did she have in common? A forgotten Vienna name." "Vienna? Oui. The Viennese courts once charged Franz Weber with art theft. Never found guilty. However, there are rumors that link him to a group of high society smugglers. Do you believe that Estelle was acquainted with him?" "She was more than familiar with Hastings. I think she paid for him. The opera is not the only setting where masks are worn. More specifically, she once attempted to destroy him." Poirot's expression was solemn now. "And some masks, Hastings, are made of vengeance rather than velvet." The rain started shortly after noon, gently pattering against the Palais Garnier's stained glass windows as though the heavens themselves wanted to hide the secrets that were being revealed inside. Unfazed by the grey curtain outside, Poirot stood in front of a row of big windows in the theatre's administrative wing, staring down at the street. But behind him, Hastings sat uneasily in a gilt-backed chair, gazing at the pages in front of him, photostatic copies of letters, notes, and clippings that Inspector Masson's men had taken from Estelle Delacroix's townhouse. His mind, however, was far from the boulevards of Paris. As Hastings turned through the pages, he noted, she corresponded frequently with someone named F.W., painting a fragmented portrait of the late socialite, art patron, widow of a shipping magnate, and now a woman with secrets deep enough to cost her life. Poetic words. A little financial discussion. A hint of bitterness, perhaps. Then the letters suddenly stopped. Poirot looked out the window. Additionally, her last letter, which was unsigned and addressed to no one, was never posted. Maybe a draft. Its tone, however, is different. Sharp. Accusatory. "I will not be silenced," he said, approaching the desk and pointing to the relevant passage. "We remember what you did in Vienna and what you believe to be buried. I'll bring your name into the spotlight if I have to. I've informed the board. I will take action if they do not." "It sounds like a threat of blackmail," Hastings whispered. "Or a warning," Poirot answered. "A last act of defiance." He paced slowly while folding his arms. "This Franz Weber had motivation if he is our F.W., which I think he is. But we have to locate him. In every story, he is the shadow, the only character that moves out of sight. Poirot tapped his finger against his temple. He asked Masson to call the theatre's manager, Renaud, and said, "So let's look where shadows hide, in records, in corners, and in names that do not belong." Poirot gave him a polite bow when he arrived, still pale and clearly exhausted from a restless night. "Monsieur Renaud, I must trouble you again," Poirot said. "I need a comprehensive list of everyone working for or connected to the opera this season. Everyone, employees, subcontractors, and guest artists." Renaud blinked. "However, Monsieur Poirot, that is," Poirot gently held up a hand. "I'll do the sorting myself. All I need is the haystack." In an hour, Poirot had a lengthy ledger in front of him, handwritten in flawless bureaucratic script: ushers, costume designers, lighting technicians, musicians, and guest performers. He studied it silently for a moment before becoming motionless. "Here," he said softly, and Hastings leaned over. "What is it?" Friedrich Wilhelm was the name Poirot tapped from the list. "Set painter is the role. Contracted 2 months earlier." Poirot said, "F.W. from Austria. Too easy to overlook." "Why a painter, though? How about using his true name?" Masson scowled. "Normally, a set painter wouldn't draw notice. It allows him access to the backstage area, the hallways, and occasionally even the boxes." "And if he needed a cover," Poirot replied, "exactly." Masson verified it by late afternoon. "And I bet his file contains little more than forged references." Friedrich Wilhelm was not listed in any Austrian or French artist registries. "Franz Weber," Poirot stated plainly, "has painted himself into a new life." However, the man was no longer at the theatre. The passport used to confirm his employment was Austrian, but the number had been filed to a man who had passed away in Prague 2 years prior. They had emptied his locker. He folded his uniform and walked away. With gloved hands, Poirot examined it. It was beautifully ironed and not hurriedly thrown away. "No panic," he whispered. Masson cursed, "He left before we started looking for him." He was aware. "He's gone," said Poirot, shaking his head. "No. He is near. Weber is not the type of man who runs at first light. They observe. They wait." Just then, there was a knock on the door. "Pardon, messieurs," said a stagehand, nervously wringing his cap as he entered. "I saw someone departing earlier through the north passage, but I wasn't sure if that was significant. Seldom is it used. Only employees are aware of it." "Explain him," Masson yelled. "Medium height. Had on a black coat. Not a hat. Held something beneath his arm." Poirot's eyes glowed as he moved as if he knew the way. "Merci, monsieur. Where does that passage lead?" "To the vaults of vintage costumes. The ones that haven't been used since the fire a decade ago." Poirot, Hastings, and Masson entered the Palais Garnier's underside in a matter of minutes. The air became colder and there were fewer lights. At the last landing, they entered a vast storage room filled with rotting wardrobes, abandoned scenery, and moth-eaten draperies. The opulence above gave way to stone and iron, corridors that had long been forgotten by everyone but the oldest staff members. A man was crouching behind an old set wall that had been painted to resemble a ballroom in Vienna. He got up as they got closer, cautiously and slowly, his hands outstretched. "You found me," he said in an accented French, and Poirot nodded. He was in his late 30s, unshaven, with sharp eyes and a silent defiance in his posture. "Franz Weber." Masson took a position. "You're being arrested." "No," Poirot replied softly, holding up a hand. "Not just yet." Weber glanced between them and said, "Let him speak." "I didn't murder her." "Then tell us what you were doing in box 5. "I swear it." Weber sighed. "She requested a meeting. She came up with the idea. She claimed that she had decided not to send the letter she had threatened. Claimed to wish to make amends. Did she? No. She insisted that I give the money back. Threatened to reveal my identity to the board, the police, and anybody else who might be interested. Claimed that by using it to re-enter Parisian society, I had damaged her husband's reputation. Hastings scowled. How much money? Weber paused. A few years back, I sold her artwork. Fakes. She was aware of their identity. She came up with the idea. She wanted to remain relevant among the collectors after her husband's wealth declined. Poirot's face was still unreadable. And yet you kept exchanging letters? She was powerful. Then guilt. She volunteered to assist me in starting over. Got me this position. I had finished forging. But you threatened her, didn't you? I just wanted to paint. Masson persisted. When she betrayed you? No, Weber replied. I didn't have to. I was heading out. Last night, I came to talk, but someone else was already there. A man. Poirot's forehead raised. He is broad-shouldered. Describe him. Costly coat. As I was leaving, he slipped by me in the hallway. He was going into her box. Can you tell who he is? I believe so. Masson took a step back. You continued to run. I was aware of the appearance, Weber remarked. And I was aware that the truth would not deter her adversaries. Inspector, I've been chased before. After staring at him for a while, Poirot turned to Hastings. It never ends well. He fears, but not because he is guilty. Of another thing. Masson scowled. So he isn't the murderer? Poirot turned to face Weber again. No. They led Weber into custody for interrogation, but Poirot's mind was elsewhere. He's a man with too many sins to confess, but not this one. He turned to Hastings as they came out into the damp twilight and said, There's another man. Weber saw it. He wandered around the boxes. Was self-assured and well off. I want to find that man. And who is he? That, Hastings, is the next act, Poirot said, gazing up at the opera house, its opulent windows now drab against the rain. Like any good opera, it will be performed with passion, deceit, and a final, fatal aria. The rain had stopped by the following morning, but Paris was still shrouded in a drab fog. Hercule Poirot stood with his hands neatly clasped behind his back on the terrace of the Palais Garnier, gazing out over the rooftops of the city. You're sure this enigmatic man Weber saw is the key? Hastings leaned on the balustrade beside him, arms crossed, brow furrowed. Below, the avenue bustled with activity, unaware of the silent storm still simmering inside the opera house. I firmly believe, Hastings, Poirot remarked, that the truth always leaves traces, no matter how small. And more than just a shadow was left by this man, this ghost who haunts the opera's hallways. Poirot retreated inside the structure and made his way to the upper floors, where the less affluent but still wealthy patrons were seated. He proceeded with the same intent as the day before, as if he were following a trail that only he could see, as he ascended the spiral staircase to the second balcony. Once there, he stopped, his gaze wandering over the lengthy hallway behind the boxes. It was dark and cramped. Without the gilded extravagance below, the atmosphere was more subdued on this level. Less examination. More discretion. Tell me, Hastings, Poirot said, what is the benefit of being spotted close to box 5 on the night of a murder? Gain? Why, absolutely nothing, unless, Hastings hesitated. Unless it was intended for public viewing. Just so, Poirot said. Madame Delacroix was not a woman who was easily frightened. She probably screamed because she saw someone she didn't expect, someone who was dangerous. And this man, this elegantly dressed man that Franz Weber portrayed, he did not come to beg or whisper. Silence fell over him. Poirot went into box 6, which was the box next to Delacroix's. The British ambassador, Sir Reginald Wilmarth, had been in it that night. Poirot surveyed the room, observing its immaculate state. Nothing was agitated. Nothing to suggest a struggle. Yet something tugged at Poirot's thoughts, something subtle that he went out and turned to Hastings. I believe, mon ami, it is time we call upon our ambassador once more. But this time, not in his official capacity. They arranged a visit to the British Embassy in the Faubourg Saint-Honoré that afternoon. The building stood grand and intimidating, its flag fluttering crisply above the courtyard. Inside, all was hushed efficiency, marble floors, high windows, and uniformed staff moving with purpose. Sir Reginald Wilmarth received them in a richly appointed sitting room, his manner stiff, eyes slightly wary. Gentlemen, he said without standing, I trust you have not come to inconvenience my office again with questions I have already answered. Poirot gave a small bow. Ah, but diplomacy, monsieur, is a delicate art. And in such circumstances, one often finds that the second conversation bears more fruit than the first. Wilmarth's eyes narrowed. What are you suggesting? Poirot smiled mildly. That perhaps you saw more than you initially admitted. You were seated directly beside the victim. Surely, something extraordinary must have attracted your attention. I told you, I saw nothing, Wilmarth replied, voice tight. Then let me propose a possibility, Poirot continued calmly. Suppose someone had reason to silence Madame Delacroix. Suppose that person entered her box just before the second act concluded. Suppose you, being a man of influence and discretion, noticed this person but chose not to speak. Not to protect the criminal, but yourself. Wilmarth's jaw tightened. You tread dangerously close to accusation. Non, monsieur. I tread carefully around truth. A woman has died. And in such moments, even diplomats must decide between silence and justice. There was a long pause. Then Wilmarth stood slowly and walked to the window, arms behind his back. I saw someone, he said at last. A man I did not recognize. He entered box 5 minutes before the scream. I assumed he was known to her. He was dressed in formal wear, nothing out of place. And then she screamed. You said nothing? I am a diplomat, Wilmarth said coldly. Discretion is part of my nature. I did not expect to become involved in a murder investigation. Nor did I wish my presence at the opera to be used for political theater. Poirot nodded. I understand, monsieur. But that man, you saw his face? Only briefly. Shaven. 40, perhaps younger. Not French. Perhaps Italian or Eastern European. Poirot gave a slight smile. You see? Already more than you imagined yourself capable of saying. As they left the embassy, Hastings muttered, he still knows more than he let on. Perhaps, Poirot said. But his fear is not of guilt, it is of implication. His concern is how this crime reflects upon him. That is not the fear of a murderer. They returned to the Palais Garnier in the late afternoon. The building felt quieter now, the frenzy of the first days settling into something colder. Poirot requested access to the wardrobe archives, rows of clothing stretching back decades, many neglected for years. What are we looking for? Hastings asked. A disguise, Poirot replied simply. Weber described a man in formal wear. Others saw a workman. Anna saw someone in a dark coat and hat. What if they were all correct? Hastings blinked. A change of clothing? Oui. And where better to change unseen than among the forgotten wardrobes of an opera house? They searched through the labyrinth and storage, and it was Hastings who finally called out, Poirot, here. Behind a rack of powdered wigs and noblemen's coats was a hanger, from which hung a modern evening coat, newer than anything else in the room. Inside the breast pocket, a monogrammed handkerchief. V.B. Poirot lifted it up gingerly. Vincenzo Bellini. The impresario? Hastings asked. But surely he wouldn't, he's the one who volunteered information about the corridor. Ah, but that, my dear Hastings, is precisely what one does when one wishes to appear helpful. Misdirection. The dude seemed too eager. Too dramatic. But what's his motive? Poirot folded the coat neatly. Let us find out. They requested Bellini's attendance once more, on the excuse of clarifying a statement. He arrived looking slightly more polished than the night before, a cane now in hand, and an expression of polite irritation. You summoned me, gentlemen? Poirot offered him a seat. A brief question only, Signor Bellini. Where were you during the second act of La Traviata? In my box, of course, Bellini said. With my guests. Several of them. Ah, but your guests say otherwise. They recall you excusing yourself just before the second act's end. Bellini paused. I may have stepped out. A telephone call. Interesting, Poirot said. Yet the telephone logs show no outgoing calls from the patron's lounge. No call, and no witnesses who saw you make one. Bellini's fingers tightened on the handle of his cane. What are you implying? That you were spotted entering box 5, Poirot said quietly. Bellini rose. This is an outrage. Outrage, monsieur, is the shield of the exposed. You wore that coat, Poirot continued, producing the garment. And you left this behind. V.B. A small detail, no? But devastating. Bellini's face drained of color. Poirot leaned in. Why did you kill her? A pause. Then Bellini dropped the cane. It clattered noisily on the floor. She was going to destroy me, he whispered hoarsely. Expose me to the entire board. She threatened to reveal what I had done in Vienna, those damned forged gallery acquisitions I sold under her name. She promised silence years ago, and now, he sat heavily. I couldn't let it happen. Not right now. Not when I had fully repaired everything. Poirot nodded. And so you used the passage you knew so well. Entered the box during the performance. Slipped poison into her glass. Left as though nothing had happened. Bellini did not deny it. He simply looked tired. Masson, who had been waiting in the corridor with officers, entered and placed a firm hand on Bellini's shoulder. You will come with us. As Bellini was led away, Poirot turned to Hastings. You see, mon ami, in opera, as in life. It is not the grand gestures that reveal the villain, but the faintest discord in the harmony. Hastings nodded. And it was that handkerchief? No, Poirot said, eyes twinkling. It was the cane. Last night, he had none.